My life changed forever on a quiet Thursday evening. I had just finished dinner when the phone rang. It was a call I never expected, one that would shatter the fragile peace I had carefully constructed over the years. My sister-in-law Kate was on the other end, her voice shaky and uneven as she delivered the news that would send my world spinning out of control. "Emma, I don't know how to tell you this, but Mom's passed away," she said, her voice breaking. I froze, the plate I was holding slipping from my hands and shattering on the floor. "What? When? How?" The words stumbled out of my mouth as I tried to process the news. My mother-in-law, the woman I had tried so hard to please, was gone. It felt surreal, impossible even. But as the initial shock wore off, a new emotion began to take its place. Duty. I needed to be there for the funeral, to pay my respects, no matter the history we shared. I quickly made plans to attend the funeral, but when I told my husband, James, his reaction was cold, almost hostile. "You can't go," he said flatly, not even bothering to look up from the newspaper he was pretending to read. "What do you mean I can't go?" I asked, my voice trembling with confusion. "She's my mother-in-law, of course I need to be there." James finally looked at me, his eyes hard and unyielding. "My mother hated you, Emma. She wouldn't want you there. You'll only cause trouble." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Sure, my relationship with my mother-in-law had always been strained, but I had no idea she felt that strongly. I was stunned, but more than that, I was hurt. How could James say something so cruel, especially now? The woman was gone, and all I wanted was to show my respect, to be there for him in his grief. But James was adamant. "Don't you dare show up, Emma," he warned, his voice icy. "I'm serious." Ignoring his harsh words, I made up my mind. I was going to that funeral no matter what he said. I needed to pay my respects, and I wasn't going to let James or anyone else stop me. The next morning, I dressed in black, the traditional color of mourning, and left the house without telling James where I was going. The drive to the funeral home felt like a journey through a fog. My mind was a blur of emotions, from anger to sadness, and a growing sense of dread that I couldn't quite shake. When I arrived, the scene was eerily calm. The funeral home was quiet, with only a few people milling about. As I walked in, my heart pounded in my chest. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I scanned the room, looking for familiar faces, but I didn't recognize anyone. And then I saw him, James, standing at the front, speaking in a low voice to the small group gathered around him. At first, I thought I had arrived at the wrong funeral, but no, there was James, and this was clearly the right place. My confusion deepened as I noticed the expressions on the faces of those around him, strangers who seemed to be mourning, but not for the woman I thought they were. James was standing next to a casket, his face a mask of solemnity. But when I moved closer, the truth hit me like a tidal wave. The name on the casket wasn't my mother-in-law's. It was someone else's entirely, someone I didn't know. My blood ran cold as I realized the enormity of what was happening. "Thank you all for coming to honor my beloved wife, Lily," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Wife? Lily?" My mind raced to comprehend what I was hearing. James was speaking as though he were mourning a woman I had never heard of, someone he was calling his wife. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the reality I knew slipping away. My hands started to tremble, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. What was going on? Who was Lily? Unable to stay silent any longer, I took a step forward, my voice trembling. "James, what is this? Who is Lily?" James's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock as he saw me standing there. For a moment, he looked like he had seen a ghost, his face pale and stricken. "Emma, what are you doing here?" he stammered, clearly caught off guard. "What am I doing here? What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Who is Lily, and why are you calling her your wife?" The room fell silent, all eyes on us. James's expression hardened, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to come up with an explanation. But before he could say anything, An older woman in the crowd spoke up. Lily was his wife, she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. They were married for a few years before she passed away. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Married? James had been married before? He had never mentioned it, not once in all the years we had been together. The revelation was like a knife to the heart. I looked at James, searching his face for any sign of remorse, but all I saw was cold calculation. Emma, I can explain, James began, but I cut him off. Зрение, гнев, который поднимается в меня как цунами. Explain? You lied to me, James. You never told me you were married before, and now I'm standing here at the funeral of a woman I didn't even know existed. How could you keep something like this from me? James took a step towards me, his expression pleading. It was complicated, Emma. I didn't want to hurt you. Lily was my past, and I wanted to move on, to start fresh with you. Start fresh? By lying to me from the beginning, I spat, my voice trembling with fury. You built our entire marriage on a lie. Before James could respond, I turned on my heel and stormed out of the funeral home, my mind racing. Everything I thought I knew about my life with James was unraveling before my eyes. How many other lies had he told me? What else was he hiding? As I drove home, my mind was a whirl of thoughts and emotions. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and above all, deeply hurt. How could James have done this to me? The man I thought I knew, the man I had shared my life with, had been living a double life, and I was only now discovering the truth. But as the shock began to wear off, I realized that I couldn't let this go. I needed answers. I needed to know the full extent of James's deception. When I got home, I started digging. I went through James's things, searching for any clue that might shed light on who this Lily was and what had really happened. And as I pieced together the fragments of his secret life, the story that emerged was more twisted and tragic than I could have imagined. James had married Lily right out of college. They had been deeply in love, or so it seemed, but their marriage had been fraught with difficulties. Lily had been diagnosed with a terminal illness just a year after their wedding, and James had spent the next few years caring for her as she slowly deteriorated. It was a heartbreaking story, one that would elicit sympathy from anyone who heard it. But there was a darker side to it, one that James had carefully hidden. As I dug deeper, I discovered that Lily's death had not been as straightforward as James had made it seem. There were rumors, whispers among those who had known them, that James had been less of a devoted husband and more of a man eager to escape his burdens. Some suggested that he had been unfaithful, that he had started seeing other women even while Lily was still alive. Others hinted at something even more sinister, that James had hastened Lily's death to free himself from the responsibility of caring for her. The more I learned, the more horrified I became. The man I had married was a stranger, someone capable of deceit and betrayal on a scale I had never imagined. But the worst was yet to come. As I continued my investigation, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A series of emails between James and a woman I had never heard of, a woman named Grace. The emails were recent, dated just a few weeks before Lily's death, and they painted a picture of a man who was not only unfaithful, but also ruthless in his pursuit of what he wanted. In the emails, James and Grace discussed their plans to be together, to start a new life once Lily was out of the picture. The language they used was cold, clinical, devoid of any emotion. It was clear that they had been planning this for some time, and that Lily's death was not the tragic accident it had been made out to be. It was murder. I felt sick to my stomach as I read the emails, the full extent of James's betrayal finally sinking in. He had killed Lily. He had taken her life to free himself from the burden of caring for her, and he had done it all so that he could be with another woman. And now, that same man was living under my roof, sleeping in my bed, pretending to be a loving husband while hiding the darkest of secrets. I knew I had to do something, but I was terrified. James was dangerous, more dangerous than I had ever imagined. If he found out what I knew, there was no telling what he might do. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Lily deserved justice, and I needed to protect myself from a man who had already proven capable of murder. I took the evidence I had gathered, the emails, the documents, everything, and went to the police. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, turning in the man I had once loved, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The police took my statement, and they assured me that they would investigate. But as I left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head, that I had just set something in motion that I couldn't control. The next few days were a blur of fear and anxiety. I kept expecting James to confront me, to demand to know what I had done, but he acted as if nothing was wrong. He went about his day as usual, completely unaware that the walls were closing in around him. It was eerie, watching him, knowing what I knew, Isrania, and wondering when he would realize that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Then, one evening, it happened. There was a knock at the door, and when I opened it, I found 2 police officers standing on my doorstep. James came up behind me, his face a mask of confusion as the officers stepped inside. "James Anderson?" one of the officers said, his tone formal. "You're under arrest for the murder of Lily Anderson." James's face went pale, and for a moment, he just stood there, stunned. Then, as the reality of what was happening sank in, he turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "Emma, what have you done?" he demanded, his voice shaking. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "I did what I had to do, James. You can't get away with this." The officers moved forward, handcuffing James as he continued to plead with me, to try to convince me that it was all a misunderstanding, that he was innocent. But I knew the truth. I had seen the evidence, and I had no doubt in my mind that James was guilty. As they led him away, I felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with a deep sadness. The man I had loved was gone, replaced by a monster I could barely comprehend. But despite everything, I knew I had done the right thing. I had stopped him before he could hurt anyone else. In the days that followed, the truth about James came out. The police investigation uncovered more than just the emails I had found. They discovered evidence that James had been planning Lily's death for months, and that he had carefully staged it to look like a natural occurrence. He had even gone so far as to manipulate her medication, ensuring that she would die slowly and painfully, all while maintaining the appearance of a devoted husband. The trial was swift, and James was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As I watched him being led away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of emotions: relief, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. But most of all, I felt a sense of closure. The nightmare was over, and I could finally begin to rebuild my life. I moved away from the town where I had lived with James, starting fresh in a new city where no one knew my past. It wasn't easy, but over time, I began to heal. I found a new job, made new friends, and slowly, I started to put the pieces of my life back together. But the scars remained. I would never forget what James had done, and I would never fully trust anyone again. The experience had changed me, made me more cautious, more guarded. But it had also made me stronger. I had faced down a monster and survived, and that was something no one could ever take away from me. As the years passed, I found peace in the simple things: walking in the park, reading a good book, spending time with the new friends I had made. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. And every year, on the anniversary of Lily's death, I visited her grave, placing flowers on the headstone of the woman whose life had been cut short by the man we both thought we knew. I would stand there in silence, reflecting on the events that had brought us together in death, and I would say a silent prayer for her, and for myself. Because in the end, we were both victims of James's lies, but we were also survivors. And that was something worth remembering.